Well, John, we are back and still in your homeland of the Bible. I'm going to call it Luke's Gospel. I'm hoping that when I suggest to you that we do a Galatians series, you'll remember all this time I've spent in Luke.
Absolutely, yes.
But we mentioned a couple of times that there's 4 miracle stories in Luke's Gospel that are not in the other Gospels, and we talked about 2 of them in our last run of episodes, and now we're going to just look at the other 2 in this episode and the next episode. So we're in Luke chapter 14, and we're going to read. There's a miracle story and then a little bit of a follow-up conversation from Jesus. So shall we just jump straight in and
let's do it
and record our podcast together?
Okay.
I love it.
Yeah, no problem. So it's Luke 14. We're jumping in at verse 1. And it says this: One Sabbath, when Jesus went to eat in the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched. There in front of him was a man suffering from abnormal swelling of his body, or some translations may have dropsy. Jesus asked the Pharisees and experts in the law, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" But they remained silent. So taking hold of the man, he healed him and sent him on his way. Then he asked them, "If one of you has a child or an ox that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull it out?" And they had nothing to say. When he noticed how the guests picked the places of honour at the table, he told them this parable: When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honour. For a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will come and say to you, "Give this person your seat." Then, humiliated, you will have to take the least important place. But when you are invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, "Friend, move up to a better place." Then you will be honoured in the presence of all the other guests. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Then Jesus said to his host, "When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or sisters or relatives, or your rich neighbours. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." Wow, beautiful. We'll leave it there. Some of our loyal listeners will know that we, of course, have leaned into the parable immediately following the end of our reading there. We've already touched on the great banquet, which we will probably have to reflect on a little bit again in the context of this miracle. But we're leaving the reading there because we've sort of covered that ground before. So
that's episode 13 of the parables series. You can go and listen to.
See, you just know this stuff. I just know we've done that. You know the number, David. That's what makes you just remarkable and amazing. You are the detail man. Thank you. Number 13, folks, if you want to catch up.
Absolutely. And the great thing about that is if you've not had enough of banquets by the end of episode 13, you can then actually jump over to the next episode, which is Matthew's story of the great banquet. I'm just going to say this right at the start, John, because I love Jesus' way. But there are moments where people say, I wonder why Jesus had, enemies. And then you read a story like this, and, Jesus is at a banquet where somebody has invited all of their friends, and Jesus decides to say, "Oh, hey, by the way, when you're having a banquet, don't invite all your friends." It's like, because they'll just invite you back. And I wonder if the people sat around the table are thinking they're not inviting you back.
Yeah, for sure. And of course, it is really interesting that this little story introduces a sort of 2 little trilogies for us, in a sense. This story is the third and final Sabbath healing in the Gospel of Luke. That's
Yes.
And I think there's a little bit of a nuance worth leaning into there. And of course, it's the third time Jesus has dinner at the house of a Pharisee in the Gospel of Luke. He's already been there in chapter 7, very controversially with Simon and that woman who
Yes.
anoints Jesus. And then chapter 11. So there's a gorgeous little collision taking place here of two sets of three. The sort of third Sabbath miracle, which I think does have nuance, and also the third Pharisaic meal. And you're absolutely right in saying, I think if Jesus wanted to write a book of how to win friends and influence people, then this may not be part of that book. But in saying that, of course, there is a beautiful subtext to Luke, in that I genuinely think that in the fact that we have three meals of Jesus with Pharisees shows his willingness to meet with the Pharisees. And in fact, if you look at chapter 11, where Jesus pronounces some of the woes on the Pharisees, it's within the context of a meal, which tends to soften it in the sense of it's probably a much more conversational style moment, rather than Jesus standing on a soapbox sort of attacking the religious community. So there is a sense in which we see him eating a lot with sinners, and we've reflected on this one in our previous episodes. But the fact that this is the third time we're seeing him in the house of a Pharisee, even though it does get a bit edgy and a bit caustic in the context of the conversation, shows that Jesus wants to be there, and he actually wants to hang out with these guys, because I think he's desperately trying to win them to his way of thinking, as of course they are with him. So fascinating little insights, I think.
And it's interesting that, like, I noticed that as I was reading this passage, the very kind of opening of verse 1, I find myself, Jesus is, he's gone to the house of the leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath day. And then there's that closing clause to the sentence, and they were watching him closely. The Greek word there, almost like if you had to sort of try and clunkily translate that word literally, it's like they were standing by the side and looking, it's and keeping guard almost over what's happening. And it just made me think about the tension that Jesus' ministry is happening under. This is actually quite a tense situation. I have been involved in interview processes before. I think you have as well. And, I've gone to a church, and the church has sort of thought, do we want to employ this guy as our pastor? And everybody does these things where it's like, come and preach for us. And then it's like, and come and have dinner. And you go to someone's house for dinner, and half of your interview panel are there, and you realize, this dinner has a purpose. This is not. We want to make sure.
Dinner.
Yes. Yeah. This is not. We just want to make sure you're not hungry. This is, when you're relaxed over food, will you say something that will get you in trouble? And that's in a positive and friendly environment I've been in. They've always been lovely experiences. But Jesus is in a situation where he's at a dinner, and everybody's waiting for him to make a mistake, because they're wanting the mistake. They actually, they want to have things go badly for him. So this tension's very, very difficult, really. And then it made me think about how much of Jesus' ministry is happening under that exact tension. There's this constant analysis going on.
For sure. And it does, if you run the line of the three Sabbath miracles, there is a wee pattern there. So the first Sabbath miracle in Luke is in Luke chapter 6, the man who has the shriveled hand.
Yes.
And he's already in the synagogue. Jesus goes in and essentially heals him. But there's a lovely connector there. In Luke 6:6, it says, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. So they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. Now, what's really interesting is that if you read Luke 6, the implication is the man's already in the synagogue, but you do get the impression that he may have been strategically positioned in the synagogue just to see what Jesus would do. So it's really interesting that. And of course,
same word as well, John. Same word
indeed,
there.
Indeed.
That they were stood by watching closely. So it's the same term.
Absolutely. So it's not like they're spying from a distance with spyware in the corner. It's like they're really up close and personal here. And maybe when you understand that, you realize some of the I don't want to be too strong here, but the aggression of Jesus in some of those moments. He is a bit distressed by their behavior. If you follow that sort of trajectory into Luke 13, which we've already done, so our listeners can go back and listen to that, the one where, behold the woman in Luke 13. It's not that they are watching him closely, but there's clearly a massive public reaction from the leader of the synagogue. So if you put Luke 6 together with Luke 13, I think what you're getting is a pattern. And I think then Luke 14 is, can I put this carefully, is as close to a setup as you're going to get. And it feels a little bit like that. So, if you look at verse 2, there was a man in front of him suffering from dropsy. Is that a coincidence? Is that sort of, he just happens to be there? Or is a sense that actually he's being positioned before him? Now, it doesn't really change the story, of course, but if you add the trajectory of chapter 14 with 6 and 13, the two other Sabbath miracles, I think you've potentially got a possible setup here where in the house of the prominent Pharisee, or at least in his courtyard, where people could listen on or watch on the proceedings, this man is suddenly positioned in front of Jesus, and you're almost getting echoes of both the previous stories. If you look at how Jesus responds, the questions he asks, the things he says, it's almost like a version of Luke 6 and Luke 13 put together. And it's worth our listeners just checking in on that. And I think that's a reflection of the growing tension between Jesus and the religious community over Shabbat and how Shabbat should be practiced. Does that make sense in terms of trying to connect those three? Around that?
Totally. And even like I'm just leafing back and forward, through my Greek New Testament as you're saying that there. It's interesting between 13 and with the woman that we talked about in the last episode, and 14. Today's episode, kai edu anthropos, and behold a man, and in verse 13, kai edu gune, and behold a woman. It's the same introduction. It's like enter stage right, the catalyst of the story.
Indeed. So in 13 we talked about the woman appearing by her own voluntary action, and that's a possibility. Here, is the man appearing by his own voluntary action, or has he been sort of nudged to the front by some of the people that Jesus is eating with? So it's worth a little consideration. That doesn't change the story, but it adds an interesting subtext to the three Sabbath miracles, and that's worth considering as a pattern.
Yes.
And I thought that was fascinating.
And so, we've read the story already, so, we can get to some detail of it shortly, but hold on that thought of the Sabbath. In his commentary on Luke, I was just leafing through recently, John Noland, he's this multi-part commentary on Luke, and he has this phrase where he says this: individuals touched by Jesus' ministry have now a new experience of Sabbath as a day of the liberation of needs. And
that's beautiful.
I love that. A new experience of the Sabbath as a day of the liberation of needs. And so I'm curious, how you react to that. I'm hearing your kind of initial emotional reaction, but this idea that Jesus is doing something with the notion of Sabbath. It's more than just, and I mean, I'm not trying to, put things that aren't there, but I don't, I don't think you want to take this story, or any of these three stories that you've just talked us through, as Jesus got up one Sabbath day and thought, oh, I know how I can really annoy everyone. I'll go do some miracles, right? I think if we ended up with that Jesus did miracles on the Sabbath because he wanted to annoy the religious establishment, I think we've misunderstood Jesus. And I think about that even in my own life. I think it comes with Celtic blood, where we like a little controversy, and and we like a little fight every now and again. Those of us that are kind of raised in, well, you and me both share some Celtic blood in that sense, don't we? And so there can sometimes be a sense of a personality type, which is just, I like being controversial, and I feel like being controversial for controversy's sake isn't a kind of holy quality, but sometimes in the pursuit of what God has called someone to, that might bring controversy. And that's what I think is going on with Jesus here, that he's actually trying to do something with our understanding of Sabbath. He's actually trying to drive something. So yeah, I mean, I'm curious. I have some other thoughts on that, but how do you respond to that sort of thought process?
Oh, I love that. I think it's on the money. I think that Jesus is not trying to get under anyone's skin. I think he is demonstrating, to quote Luke 6 again, that he is Lord of the Sabbath, that actually he is redefining, reinterpreting, reshaping, representing the original ideas of Shabbat. And, if you go back to the original day of rest, as it were, day 7 of creation, this is a day when God doesn't need to rest because God is God, self-sufficient and eternal. Yet he enters rest. And the first humans, man and woman, have just been made. They don't need a rest. They haven't done anything yet. So the rest of that first week of creation has nothing to do with physicality. Nothing to do with physicality. It can't be, because God doesn't need physical rest. And the man and the woman, unless, they've been made badly, they don't need a physical rest on their first day of full creation, because they've done anything. So something else is in the rest. And interestingly, David, in the Genesis account, it's the only day without boundary. Evening and morning, the first day. That goes right up to day 6. When it comes to day 7, there is no evening and morning. Now, again, in the Hebraic pattern, that can't be a coincidence. That can't be a fluke. I think something is being powerfully nuanced there to say that Shabbat was never, ever meant to be confined to a day of regulation. What it was meant to be, as it were, a disposition. It was meant to be something that we lived and understood as a lifestyle. And therefore, that whatever work now the humans do, they work out of rest. They're not resting from work, which is our pattern generally, but they're working out of rest. That's a profound idea in the Genesis text, and one, I think, which Jesus is bringing back to us. He's bringing back the message of liberation. And of course, if you macro that into Luke 4, where Jesus is clearly announcing Jubilee, he's clearly announcing this idea of a year of complete freedom, Shabbat, restoration of all things. I mean, then there's a macro Shabbat that he's bringing in. It's not just he keeps the Sabbath because he's a good Jewish man, but there is a macro Shabbat he's bringing, which is all to do with the liberation of the poor and the setting free of the captive and the opening the eyes of the blind. So you get this magnificent. So if that's part of his programmatic idea, that he's bringing macro Shabbat, this Jubilee Shabbat, then every time he does a miracle on the Sabbath, it's not about getting up somebody's nose. It's not about irritating the religious. It is actually about announcing what Shabbat was always intended to be, a time of liberation, life, restoration, realignment, redemption. All of those amazing ideas are contained in these miracles. And I think if you lean into that, then actually there's a much bigger idea being captured.
I want to talk about Sabbath more. I want to keep exploring that with you, John. I mean, so you wrote a book on Sabbath a few years ago, didn't you? And so
I did. I wrote a little book called First Day, So the idea that day 7, Shabbat, it's not called Shabbat in Genesis, but that first Sabbath, as it were, was day 7 in the week of creation, but the first day of humans' journey. And from sort of those nuances that something first is very powerful in biblical thinking. So I just leaned into what was it about, and what does it maybe look like in a 21st century context? And then there's been some great books brought out recently, and some. I have to say I was influenced tremendously in terms of my some of my Jewish thinking by Abraham Heschel's book Sabbath, which is just superb. Written from a strong Jewish viewpoint, of course, but well worth consideration in understanding our ideas around Shabbat. So. Brilliant stuff. Yeah. So I'm sure if people are interested, but
John, I want to put you on the spot. Do you remember who it was that got you that Abraham Joshua Heschel book?
I think it was you that recommended it.
It was me. I remember. You remember a beautiful conversation we had with that, and I was like, we've got to do that. I always feel, I don't mention that for any boasting reasons, John. More, I always feel like the roots of great friendship are found in sharing books with each other, aren't they?
Absolutely. No,
oh my!
No. I still have that book in my library, mate. It's fabulous.
I think of all of my great friendships, and they've all involved books somewhere along the line. It's like now I know I'm loved, right? But the one of the things I love about what Heschel does is he talks about how. And please correct me if I'm misquoting, because I'm doing this a bit from memory here, John. But Heschel talks about how God, in the creation story, gives humanity this role of guiding. The language is domination, even of creation. That humanity's job is to care for this creation, right? But that God's job in the creation story is time. And Heschel talks about how what humanity wants to do is we want to control time, because we actually want to try and control everything. And Sabbath is this way of reminding us that we're not in control of time, that every 6 days there'll be another day comes and you have to stop. And I think to me, I find that really interesting as a thought process, that I want to be in control. And Sabbath reminds me that I'm not in control of all the things I think I'm in control of. And then you think about the arguments that Jesus is having. They're arguments about control, aren't they? You can't heal this person here, and you can't heal those people over there. I find that really deeply resonating with me, John. This idea, not just of what I'm seeing in the story of Jesus, but even in my own life and my desire to control everything.
For sure. And one of Heschel's beautiful phrases in that book is that he describes Shabbat as holiness in time. Holiness in time. And I love that. So there's something of the sacred in that moment. And of course, what he's appealing for is and I think actually, ironically and gloriously, this is the spirit of Jesus in the conversation. What he's appealing for is that if Shabbat is reduced down to a day, then it can become something very functional. But actually, it is about the inhabitation of God in time. It's about God coming into the moment. It's about us conscious of God in the moment and inviting him in. Now, if you land that idea on Jesus, this is exactly what we're seeing in these Shabbat miracles, that you've got literally God entering that time. He's entering that moment. He's bringing something into that Shabbat experience, which I think God always intended there to be, but over years of change, tradition, and control, these things are now not only not expected, but no one can remember the last time anything like this happened. And now, in a relatively short space of time, this radical young rabbi from up the north is like bouncing around synagogues, and people are getting healed in synagogues on Shabbat. Now, chapter 14 is not in the synagogue, but like in the house of the Pharisee, that's a pretty that's a pretty religiously loaded context. I mean, that's as loaded as it's going to be outside of somewhere like a synagogue.
Well, a ruling
first-century
Pharisee,
world.
not just your run-of-the-mill Pharisee.
For sure. So he is challenging, and of course, isn't it interesting that in 2 of the 3 Shabbat miracles, he asks the question, is it lawful? All right, he's asking them. And then in the 3rd one, or the middle one, if you like, chapter 13, he's absolutely told, you are out of order. You cannot heal on the Sabbath. And then that's when he responds with, well, what about your donkey? If it's good enough for your donkey to be loosed, it's good enough for her to be loosed. So it's interesting that all 3 miracles are connected to explanation and questions, which again, for our listeners, we're leaning into not just what Jesus does in the miracle, but the message behind the miracle. And the 3 Shabbat miracles definitely lean into a dynamic holiness in time liberation message, which is much deeper than the miracle itself being performed.
And there's also Jesus is actually, I think you see Jesus doing this everywhere. It's again this idea of harmony and fulfillment with the story of God. So I often think about what does Sabbath do? And so we root Sabbath obviously in the creation story, but Sabbath really appears for Israel as a thing after the Exodus, doesn't it? And there's this incredible depth, I think, to this idea that a group of slaves who were being worked to death by the Egyptians, slaves who were being asked to make bricks with no straw, and they leave the slavery. They cross the Red Sea into the desert. They've got this miraculous provision of manna as food and quail as meat, and then they get given this Sabbath. On the 7th day, you'll do nothing. And I think that it's important not to miss the power of that to a group of slaves. Right? Your entire existence, the reason you've been fed, provided for, and given, even though it's minuscule, some level of care, is because you're a machine. Right? Is because you can build things for us, your slave masters. And the first thing that God does to the people is say, you can have a day off. You can have a day wherein you produce nothing and you still have value. And that God will actually give you food that day, even though you've not done any work. And this upsets a philosophical piece that was there, I think, in the mind of a slave, that I can only live if I'm producing. And I want to almost just take that from that time period to the 21st century and say, I wonder if we've still forgotten that lesson, that we are in other forms. And I want to be very cautious saying this because obviously slavery still exists in the world today, but there's also implicit and hidden slaveries. The slavery to production that we have in the contemporary Western context, particularly, where it's like, what am I doing? What am I achieving? And what am I getting? And I wonder if we've still not learned this lesson that God wanted to teach the Israelites was one of the things that happens in a day off is that you are reminded that your value is not found in what you do, in what you create, in what you produce,
For sure. It's beautiful. And of course it does fly in the face of a philosophy that is inherent, I think, in the West of I do, therefore I am. And I think it's Greenberg who, in his book, talks about the challenge of Sabbath that says we are, when we practice Sabbath, we are unjustified by our productivity.
Oh, it's so
now,
good.
If you lean back into the Genesis account, I think it's all there. So before the man and the woman are set to work to rule the earth, subdue the earth, and fill the earth, God says, enter rest. Beautiful. And I think not only are you getting a work from rest, but I think one of the profound ideas, and this leans back to our Sabbath miracles, David, one of the profound ideas is that the Lord is saying in Shabbat, you are worth because of who you are, not because of what you do. You are not justified, you are not valued by your productivity, because the first humans are valued and they haven't done anything yet. They're valued because they're made in the image of their creator. So if you carry that idea forward to these gorgeous miracles, then it's interesting. All three people who are healed are marginalized. They are worth less. I don't mean worthless is one word, but they are worth less on the strata of their society. And Jesus heals on the Sabbath because he is restoring worth to these people. Daughter of Abraham. This man healed in the presence of a prominent Pharisee's house. And actually, you've got a sense of what are these Sabbath healings doing? Well, they're not just giving people use of their physicality back. They are restoring their worth and value back. And what better place to restore worth than on a day that was established on the basis of human worth? And I think that's part of the spirit of Sabbath that Jesus is bringing back into this. And a little interesting nuance here, David, on this is that dropsy was an interest. I mean, the Greek on that is very, very interesting. Literally, sort of, it's a word that points to water and face, and the idea that the face becomes filled with water is the sort of so the idea of dropsy here, or whatever this was, literally the person becomes inflated. They become bloated, as it were. And there is some research that suggests that people with dropsy were often used as metaphors of greed and avarice because they looked bloated, they looked obese, they looked large, they looked as if they were living a greedy life. Right. And how tragic that not only are these people suffering, but now their suffering is used as a metaphor for something that has absolutely nothing to do with their suffering. And Jesus, in the midst of Shabbat, the day of worth and value, the day of freedom and restoration, sets this man free, heals and looses him. And I think there's a bit of a worth value conversation going on in just that moment as well. If we're connecting it to Shabbat, that makes sense.
It's awesome because that something I noticed in verse 6 that I was just reading when I was preparing for our conversation today. A lot of the translations say something like verse 6 is something like they couldn't answer or they didn't have a reply. But it's quite interesting, again, in its form in the Greek. In the Greek, it's fine. Like, they couldn't answer this is a totally okay translation. But the way the Greeks functions is it's like, it literally kind of reads, and they were not able, the word is iskousan, it's almost, they were almost not strong enough, is kind of alluded to in that. It's the notion of strength. They were not able to give a reply to this one, right? And I think what you get in the Greek that's just not so explicit in the English is it's they can't offer a reply to Jesus' logic, right? To this. It's not that they're, I can't think of anything to say. It's that actually your logic is too good there. There's nothing I can say back to that. I love that sense of, because Sabbath is about value. Because Sabbath is not about greed. And we've got this person here, if we listen into your nuance, that potentially is sometimes perceived as a public image of greed when actually the opposite is true. We've got somebody for whom society wants to ignore. There's a whole host of Sabbath images. So Jesus' point to say, but this is Sabbath. And actually, and this is where I loved Nolan's comment, that people now have a new experience as Sabbath as a day of liberation. Well, actually, ironically, Sabbath was always a day of liberation, but it had become a day of control. It had become a day of the wrong things, and Jesus holds that in. And I wonder then if that's the link to the next part of the story, wherein Jesus now starts to talk about honor and status and where you sit at the table, because it's still a conversation about how we perceive worth and value. Do you think that's the connecting piece?
Oh, I do. Absolutely 100%. And I think if you grab the sort of value idea, worth idea, that really pushes through nicely into the first little mini parable, because you've sort of got immediately after the healing, you've got like these two little mini parables that sort of relate. Like the best seats in the house, verses 7 to 11. And then the dinner party conversation, verses 12 to 14. And they almost sit together like a nice little couplet. They're different, but they're very, very similar. But they are saying different things in this context. And it is interesting, they're building to a climax. So, best seats in the house stuff. Jesus noticed people are taking the seats of honor. And he essentially tells a funny little story. You don't want to be caught in the wrong seat, essentially. And if you've got your head screwed on here, sit in the lowest seat because it's better to be called up. And then he says this: everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and the humble will be exalted. And this sort of idea of not leaning into your own sort of sense of importance within this, but making sure you are understanding your worth and value in relationship to the Lord. Not to your own perceived status, because within that parable of the best seats, it's all about how they perceive status, the seats of honor, the seats that we think are the best seats. And the Lord's essentially saying, but actually that's got nothing to do with what we're about. And if we live our life according to that value system, we'll end up really leaning into exalting ourselves. And that gets us on the wrong side of the equation when it comes to the Lord. And then, of course, when you lean into the dinner party one, it climaxes almost leaning back to the man with dropsy. It climaxes with, but when you give a banquet, invite who? Well, the poor. Invite the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Now, here's an interesting thought, David. Though the man with dropsy was there, he wasn't invited. And that's again where I suspect this is a setup. So he has been strategically positioned in front of Jesus. He's certainly not been invited to this dinner party. So not only does Jesus heal him, but Jesus then flags up the fact, I know what you've been up to. I know this guy isn't here because you want him at your dinner table, because you wouldn't be caught dead with someone like him at your dinner table. But I'm telling you, he's the sort of person you should be inviting to your dinner table. And if you do that, then you will be blessed, and in the most incredible way. And then that climax, of course, leads into the great banquet, which we'll pause there. But I think those two mini parables are absolutely connected to what's going on with healing on the Sabbath.
No, I love that. It's funny, as a humorous aside, John, I've had both these things happen to me. I was once invited to a black tie event, and I was pastor at the time, and I was asked if I would come to this event at it was a Rotary Club event, and I was invited to come and say the grace before the meal. And so it was a black tie event, so it was full, as you can see, I'm not the type of person that often wears black tie, but I was there, my wife came with me, and we were all dressed up. It was so hot this day, John. It was that one day of the British year that's so hot that everything is melting. And it was so hot that I was standing outside, having the kind of canapes before we go in to sit down. And the tops of my toes were burning in my shoes because it was that hot this afternoon. And so I arrive into this big hall, and I'm scooching around table number 20 to 23 looking for our seats, right? And the president of the Rotary Club comes up to me and says, no, you're at the top table with us. I was like, oh my goodness, and it was like this proper top table. So we make our way up and we sit at the top table. And I thought to myself, this was great, because we're at the most honored place, right? But it was so anyway. We start the meal, and then the president, after my prayer, the president says, "Listen, it's very, very hot." He said, "So we're going to dispense with usual protocol." This is showing how British this moment was. But he says, "We're going to dispense with usual protocol and allow gentlemen to take off their jackets during dinner." And I was thinking, oh, thank goodness, because I had a the kind of shirt, tie, waistcoat, and all that on. And just as I was about to move to take off, I was sat next to the president of the golf club that were hosting the dinner. Just as I was about to remove my jacket, the president of the golf club turns to me and says, "A gentleman should never take off his jacket." And I'll be honest, I chickened out and I kept my jacket on, melted my way through dinner, but I could see table 23 and they were all in their shirts, looking comfortable while I melted at the table.
Yes. That was a moment where you would have liked to have been humbled.
Yes.
And returned to 23.
I would have been quite happy if they said, "What's he doing at the top table? Go and sit in the shade over there with those people." More seriously, though, John, I only tell that story to make us laugh. But there's an underlying grace narrative that's quite beautiful in this that I think is always worth highlighting. That Jesus is talking about gift exchange in this. I can host a dinner and invite you. And the question is how, even we talked earlier, I've bought you a book, you've bought me books, we've both bought each other books. At some level, you might say, how generous is that really? Because we like each other. Really, I want you to read the book. But you've given great gifts to me. I've given, it's just how it works in friendship. But at some point, somebody might say, well, is that really grace and generosity anymore? When you then give a book to somebody that will never be able to give you a book back, or invite somebody who can, and the moment you start talking about, well, this person might not be able to repay this, you've now moved into grace, haven't you? You've now moved into, well, this is unearned, what we're dealing with here, and unrepayable. And so you realize that this Jesus vision of a banquet table is rooted in all of that Sabbath stuff again. That you're not going to work today, but you are going to have food, and you can't pay that back, and God's going to keep us alive. And it's all part of the story. You're going to work from rest. It just seems to me that if you're willing to sort of peel back all the layers of the onion, all of Jesus' core theologies are being kind of moved around here in what seems like, if you're not careful, a relatively throwaway comment about who you should invite to a dinner party.
Yeah, no, superb. And of course, it all starts with this incredible act of grace that, Jesus, in ministering to this man, he asks the question, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? Is it so in a sense, he's asking a grace question. He's asking,
yes,
is it okay to dispense grace on Shabbat? I mean, that's what he's asking, isn't it?
Yeah. Which, of course, in our story, is so ridiculous a question, actually, because Shabbat has always been about grace, isn't it?
Of course it has. Of course it has. But of course, remember, we're on a trajectory. So this is This is the third Sabbath healing clash about to come up. So, and on both occasions, we've had the same nutty sort of, and I mean nutty, I mean difficult, I don't mean crazy nutty. I mean the same nutty sort of idea that's gnawed away at the heart of this. Actually, is this good to do or not? Jesus preempts this by asking the question, right, okay, is it okay to dispense grace on Shabbat? And the answer has got to be, well, of course it is. But of course, their response is silence. They remain silent. Yes, and then it says this, and I love the phraseology here, taking hold of the man. He healed him and loosed him. And of course, in my English translation, it sent him away. It's that apoluo again. We bumped into that a few times in our journeys together, that loosing idea that's in Luke 13. And he doesn't just heal him, but looses him. Now, of course, I think the nuance are he sends him on his way. But what a beautiful picture there of grace. Yeah. He takes hold of him. The man doesn't ask.
Yeah.
In fact, the man never speaks, never says anything.
I know,
Jesus
right?
takes hold of him, a proactive moment of grace. He heals him and then sends him. He doesn't ask anything from him. He doesn't say, right, okay, fill in this card, join my club, join my team. Oh, and by the way, on your way out, make sure you drop some coins in the box. It's nothing. He's just healed and sent. Yeah. Healed and sent. Healed and it's just it. And to me, this is magnificent grace, which then the two parables sort of nudge into. If you're vying for the best places, you've missed the point of God's economy. And also, if you're only inviting people who are going to pay you back, literally or metaphorically, into your world, then you're missing something of the greatness of God's grace and generosity in the kingdom. So I think it's a powerful strain the whole way through. This isn't just a miracle, which of course it is, and the man gets wonderfully healed, but it is a powerful Shabbat message at the heart of this miracle, which this community more than most really, 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 really need to get. And isn't it interesting that Jesus is reserving this message for this moment? Because it's this group of people that absolutely have to get this message. If they get this, the world changes. Sabbath suddenly gets liberated. People get liberated, and the kingdom of God can come. If these people don't get it, then they're going to continually resist the Lord of the Sabbath doing what he wants to do on the Sabbath.
Yeah. And it's, I mean, oh goodness, there's so much in that, isn't there, for us to just rewind that bit and listen to everything John said there again. That's the best thing I want to say right there. Go to that bit on your phone. It allows you just to go back, a minute or so. Like, don't miss that's being said just there. That's really, really important to grasp what Jesus is doing there, because there's warning for us in that, and there's grace for us in that. I just noticed, John, as you're saying that, the verse 4, again, my translation says they said nothing. Some translations, but they were silent. The nuance of the text is that they became silent. And I almost feel like there's this little message for us today, that when you find yourself leaning into places of control, leaning into places of exclusion, leaning into places of needing to earn things, it's almost like probably the best thing for you to do is be quiet. Probably the best thing for you to do is just become silent, because you're going to miss. Jesus, is it lawful? Is it lawful to cure people on the Sabbath or not? But they became silent. So Jesus held him, healed him, and released him. If nobody else is going to object to this, this is just what I'm going to do. And I'm just thinking, John, personally, how easy it is to fight for that control, just not over something like Sabbath, over everything, and to exclude and work it out and to hold particular space. And I think there's something really powerful in what Jesus is modeling for us here, of just making sure that when we're about to lean into trying to control things, we may want to go quiet and just think about how Jesus behaves.
For sure. I think that's beautiful. And I think that is the spirit of Sabbath. And I would urge all of us to consider inviting the Lord of the Sabbath into our world, inviting that mentality of grace, generosity, of trust, that he is greater than the circumstances we face, and also he is bigger than the situations we're in, and he's able to lead and guide us and help us in the midst of all of that. And absolutely, I think it's a beautiful, beautiful thought.